At 9:16, I was just another employee leaving the building with a cardboard box and a quiet goodbye. At 9:17, the investors opened my contract and found section 4.2. And suddenly, the woman the CEO called replaceable owned the one thing the entire company could not survive without. The elevator doors slid open with a soft metallic sigh, and for a moment, Isabella just stood there, holding the cardboard box like it weighed more than it should. Not because of the laptop charger or the notebooks inside, but because 8 years of quiet loyalty had just been folded into it like old receipts. Behind her, the glass walls of the executive floor shimmered in the morning light. Everything looked polished, efficient, successful. The kind of place that liked to believe people were interchangeable parts in a perfect machine. Promotion? The CEO had said 10 minutes earlier, leaning back in his chair as if the idea amused him. Don't be ridiculous, Isabella. You're replaceable. The sentence had landed lightly in the room, almost politely, like a paper cut. Small, clean. But paper cuts bleed longer than people expect. She hadn't argued. That was the part that confused him. Isabella had simply nodded, folded her hands in her lap, and listened as HR explained the termination package in the calm, rehearsed tone of someone who had practiced the speech many times. 8 years condensed into bullet points. Security badge deactivated at noon. Company property returned immediately. Exit form signed before leaving the building. Standard procedure. Through the glass wall, she could see employees moving between desks. Coffee cups, glowing monitors, quiet keyboard clicks. The usual morning rhythm of a tech company preparing to impress investors later that day. The irony sat quietly in Isabella's chest. Investors. She almost smiled. Any questions? The HR manager asked. Isabella looked down at the document. The exit form waited patiently for her signature. Her eyes drifted over the legal paragraphs, not because she needed to read them, but because reading contracts had become second nature over the years. When you worked on something valuable enough, you learned quickly that code wasn't the only thing worth protecting. The CEO tapped his pen against the desk. Impatient. He had already moved on mentally. In his mind, the story was finished. Employee asks for promotion. Employee gets dismissed. Employee disappears. Another line erased from the company chart. But Isabella knew something he had forgotten, or maybe something he had never noticed. Her pen hovered above the paper for a brief moment. Then she signed. The CEO stood up immediately, satisfied. Good. HR will escort you out. Escort. As if she might steal something on the way out. Isabella closed the folder gently and slid it across the desk. Of course, she said. Her voice was calm, almost warm. The kind of tone people use when they're closing a conversation they no longer care to continue. For a split second, the CEO seemed almost disappointed. No anger, no tears, no dramatic speech, just quiet acceptance. It robbed him of the victory he expected. Isabella rose from the chair and picked up the cardboard box HR had placed beside the door. Inside it lay the small remains of a professional life, a framed photo of her parents, a fountain pen she liked too much to leave in the office, a notebook filled with sketches of ideas that had slowly grown into something much larger. The core algorithm, the thing the company had started calling their breakthrough, the thing investors were flying in to hear about today. The hallway outside felt cooler. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and printer toner. A few coworkers looked up as she passed. Surprise flickered across their faces. Then curiosity. Layoffs were rumors that moved quickly through office floors like wind through tall grass. Everything okay? Someone whispered near the marketing desks. Isabella offered a small smile. Of course. She kept walking. At the end of the corridor, the floor-to-ceiling windows opened to the city skyline. Morning light spilled across the polished concrete, turning the office into a bright stage where everything looked confident and permanent. But Isabella had spent years working with systems, and systems, she knew, always had hidden hinges. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. For a few quiet seconds, the building hummed around her, the soft mechanical rhythm of cables, servers, distant conversations. 8 years. She remembered her first day here. Back then, the company had been smaller, scrappier, full of people who stayed late because they believed in what they were building. Back then, the CEO had called her indispensable. The word had aged badly. The elevator numbers ticked downward. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. A calendar reminder appeared on the screen. 9:15. Investor briefing preparation. Isabella glanced at the time. 9:13. 2 minutes before the meeting started upstairs. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. The elevator reached the lobby with a gentle ding. Glass doors opened to the street where the city moved with its usual Monday morning certainty. Taxis sliding through traffic, pedestrians rushing with headphones and coffee cups, sunlight reflecting off steel and glass. The world had not noticed her firing. Of course it hadn't. But the building behind her was about to notice something else. Isabella crossed the lobby slowly. The security guard behind the desk gave her a sympathetic nod. "Sorry to see you go," he said. "Thank you," she replied softly. At the exit, she paused long enough to place her company laptop on the reception counter. The final piece of property returned. Procedure completed. Across the street, investors were already arriving. Tailored suits, confident strides, the quiet gravity of people who moved large amounts of money with small decisions. Upstairs, the CEO would soon begin the presentation. Slides, metrics, promises. And somewhere inside those slides sat the centerpiece of everything, the core patent. Isabella stepped outside. The morning air felt surprisingly light. Behind her, the glass building reflected the sky like a mirror, pretending nothing inside it could ever break. She adjusted the box in her arms and began walking down the sidewalk. At exactly 9:17, 3 floors above the CEO's confident presentation, a lawyer would quietly open a contract and point to a small paragraph most people had never bothered to read. Section 4.2. And in that moment, the word replaceable would begin to sound very expensive. At 9:15 sharp, the conference room on the 23rd floor filled with the kind of quiet energy that only large investments create. Glass walls, a long walnut table, screens glowing softly with the first slide of the presentation. The CEO stood at the head of the room, perfectly composed, confident. The performance of certainty wrapped around him like a tailored suit. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "today you'll see why our company is about to redefine the entire market." Investors leaned forward slightly. Pens clicked. Tablets woke up. The slide behind him displayed a sleek title: Project Atlas, the Core Optimization Engine. No one noticed the absence yet. Why would they? Isabella had never been the one giving presentations. She had always been the one who made them possible. The CEO moved through the first slides with polished ease, market projections, growth curves, glowing numbers that climbed upward like confident staircases. A few investors nodded. One of them raised a hand. "The patent filing," he said. "You mentioned exclusive ownership in the briefing memo. Is that fully secured?" The CEO smiled. "Completely." The word hung in the air with comfortable certainty. Across the table, the company's legal counsel, Daniel Mercer, shifted slightly in his chair. Just a small movement. But lawyers lived inside details the way engineers lived inside systems, and one detail had begun quietly knocking on the inside of his memory. He opened the digital contract folder on his tablet, scrolling. Paragraphs passed like calm water. Employment agreements, internal IP policies, standard clauses, routine, until his finger paused. A small section heading appeared on the screen. Section 4.2, Foundational Intellectual Property Rights. Daniel leaned forward a little closer. The room continued around him. The CEO spoke confidently about scalability and market disruption. Investors murmured approval. A graph appeared showing projected growth that looked almost vertical. But Daniel was no longer listening. He was reading. Once, then again, carefully. Across the table, an investor asked another question. "So the algorithm itself is entirely company-owned?" "Yes," the CEO said without hesitation. Daniel looked up slowly. The silence that followed lasted less than a second, but something in the room shifted, like a subtle change in air pressure before a storm. "Actually," Daniel said calmly, We should clarify something. The CEO paused mid-sentence. It was a tiny interruption, but investors turned their heads immediately. Money had a sensitive ear for hesitation. Daniel rotated his tablet so the nearest investor could see the document. This is Isabella Moran's employment contract. The CEO's expression flickered briefly. Former employee, he corrected. Daniel didn't react. He tapped the highlighted paragraph. Section 4.2. Several investors leaned closer. Legal text filled the screen. Dense, careful, the kind of language designed to survive scrutiny. One of the investors adjusted his glasses and read aloud slowly. Any foundational intellectual property independently developed by the employee prior to formal company incorporation remains the sole property of the employee, licensed to the company under operational agreement unless renegotiated in writing. The words settled across the table like a quiet snowfall. The CEO frowned slightly. That's standard language, he said. It doesn't apply here. Daniel's voice stayed even. It might. He tapped the screen again. The core algorithm was originally developed 18 months before the company incorporated. A few investors exchanged looks. Numbers were powerful, but ownership was absolute. Are you saying the patent isn't ours? Someone asked. Daniel answered with the calm precision of a man used to uncomfortable truths. I'm saying the patent rights belong to Isabella. The room became very still. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through the office with coffee cups and laptops, unaware that the air inside the conference room had suddenly grown heavy. The CEO let out a short laugh. That's impossible. But the confidence in his voice had thinned. Daniel scrolled again, opening another document. The original patent filing. Applicant name. Isabella Marine. Filed years before investors had ever heard the company's name. Another investor leaned back slowly in his chair. So the company doesn't own the core technology. Daniel chose his words carefully. The company has been operating under a license agreement implied by her employment contract. A pause stretched across the room. Then someone asked the question that changed everything. And she still works here? The CEO's jaw tightened. A moment earlier, the answer would have been simple. Now it sounded different. No, he said quietly. Across the table, three investors looked at each other. A subtle calculation passed between them, silent, fast, instinctive. If the patent belonged to Isabella, then the entire valuation model upstairs in the presentation deck had just developed a crack running straight through its foundation. Daniel closed the document slowly. There's one more detail. The CEO looked at him sharply. What detail? Daniel spoke with the careful neutrality lawyers practiced for years. The operational license is tied to her employment status. The CEO didn't move. One investor leaned forward. And what happens if she's no longer employed? Daniel held the room with a quiet sentence. The license may no longer be valid. Silence. A deep, stunned silence. Somewhere on the street below, traffic moved through the city without noticing that millions of dollars had just become very uncertain. The CEO's voice came out tighter than before. When was she terminated? Daniel checked the timestamp on the HR document. 9:12 this morning. A few investors glanced automatically at their watches. 9:17. Exactly 5 minutes had passed. One of them leaned back and exhaled slowly. Well, he murmured, that timing is unfortunate. Another investor looked directly at the CEO. You said she was replaceable. The sentence hung in the air. Not angry, just factual. The CEO didn't answer. Because at that exact moment, somewhere several floors below, Isabella was walking calmly down the street with a cardboard box in her arms, while the company she had quietly built its future for was discovering that its most valuable asset had just walked out the door. And none of the investors in that room were thinking about the presentation anymore. They were thinking about one question. Where was Isabella right now? Do you think the CEO understood what he had done yet? Comment your guess and stay with the story to see how Isabella's quiet move changes everything. The city morning carried on with indifference. Cars moved through intersections, cafes filled with quiet conversations, and sunlight spilled across the sidewalks as if nothing unusual had happened. Isabella walked 2 blocks before stopping, not because she was tired, because she had always liked the cafe on the corner. 8 years earlier, she had written the first draft of the algorithm there, on a borrowed laptop and a napkin full of equations that looked like nervous handwriting. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as she stepped inside. Warm air wrapped around her immediately. Coffee, toasted bread, the low murmur of people beginning their day. A few customers glanced up. No one recognized the woman who had just quietly changed the future of a technology company. Isabella set her cardboard box beside a small window table and sat down. For the first time that morning, she exhaled slowly. Across the street, the company's glass tower reflected the sky like a polished shield. From here, it looked powerful, untouchable. She knew better. Systems always appeared strongest right before someone discovered the missing bolt. The barista approached with a friendly smile. The usual? Isabella nodded. Please. As the coffee machine hummed to life, her phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she answered. Isabella Marine speaking. A measured voice responded. Ms. Marin, this is Daniel Mercer from your former company. Former. The word sounded almost ceremonial. Yes, Isabella said calmly. A brief pause followed, the kind lawyers use when deciding how direct to be. There appears to be a legal question regarding Section 4.2 of your employment agreement. Isabella looked through the window at the building across the street. Sunlight flashed along the glass edges like quiet laughter. I assumed someone would notice eventually. Daniel cleared his throat softly. The investors noticed? The barista placed a cup of coffee in front of her. Steam curled upward in thin spirals. How quickly? Isabella asked. 5 minutes into the presentation. She allowed herself the smallest smile. Efficient. Daniel continued. The board would like to speak with you. Of course they would. Another pause. This one heavier. Off the record, Daniel said carefully. Were you aware that terminating your employment would affect the license agreement? Isabella stirred her coffee slowly. The spoon touched porcelain with a quiet chime. I assumed the legal department understood the contract. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Across the table from him, 23 floors above the city, investors were now speaking in low, intense voices. The CEO sat rigidly at the end of the table while the presentation slides remained frozen on a glowing screen. The room that had felt powerful 15 minutes earlier now felt uncertain. Back in the cafe, Isabella took a small sip of coffee. Still good. Still exactly the same as it had been 8 years ago. Ms. Marin, Daniel said, choosing his words with care, the board is asking if you would consider renegotiating the license. Isabella looked at the cardboard box beside her chair. A framed photo leaned against the side, her parents smiling at a beach where the wind had tangled everyone's hair. They had always told her something simple. Build things carefully, and read contracts even more carefully. What exactly are they proposing? She asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. They would like to restore your position immediately. Isabella laughed softly, not mockingly, just thoughtfully. That's interesting, she said. Across the street, several black cars had just arrived outside the glass building. Investors were leaving the conference room now, walking through the lobby with expressions that mixed irritation with calculation. The atmosphere inside the company had changed. People could feel it without understanding why. Rumors moved through offices faster than official explanations. Something about the patent. Something about Isabella. Someone in marketing whispered that the presentation had stopped halfway through. Someone in engineering checked the internal chat channels and noticed an unusual message from legal. Meanwhile, Isabella watched the building calmly from her cafe table. The tower still looked impressive. But now it reminded her of a chessboard where someone had suddenly realized the queen had quietly left the game. Ms. Marin, Daniel said gently, the board would prefer to resolve this situation quickly. Quickly, Isabella repeated. Her voice held a trace of irony now. For 8 years, I worked nights refining that algorithm. For 8 years, the company used it to attract investors, partnerships, press coverage. She took another sip of coffee. Today, they discovered who actually owns it. Daniel didn't interrupt, because the truth didn't require embellishment. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the glass tower's reflection. Tell the board something for me, Isabella said finally. I'm listening. The patent isn't a problem. Daniel blinked. I'm not sure I understand. Isabella's gaze remained steady on the building across the street. The algorithm works because of a very specific architecture. She paused. And the architecture isn't in the patent. Silence stretched through the phone line. Daniel sat up straighter in his chair. Where is it? Isabella's voice stayed calm. Inside my notebooks. Across the street, the company's glass facade reflected the sky in perfect silence. For the first time that morning, the balance of power had shifted completely. And somewhere on the 23rd floor, the CEO was beginning to realize that firing Isabella had not removed a problem. It had removed the only person who knew how the company's most valuable invention actually worked. By 10:02, the atmosphere inside the company had changed completely. The same office floor that had buzzed with ordinary Monday energy now carried a quieter, sharper tension. Conversations dropped when someone from legal walked past. Screens filled with internal messages. Managers spoke in hushed voices behind glass doors. Something had gone wrong. No one knew exactly what, but everyone could feel it. On the 23rd floor, the conference room still held the investors. The presentation slides had long since gone dark, leaving only the faint reflection of worried faces in the glass screen. The CEO stood by the window with his arms crossed. From up here, the city looked calm, orderly, predictable. Nothing like the room behind him. One of the investors closed a folder with a quiet snap. Let me understand this clearly, she said. Your company's core technology is licensed from an employee you terminated 15 minutes before this meeting. The CEO's jaw tightened. That's a temporary misunderstanding. Is it? Another investor replied. Daniel Mercer remained seated, his tablet resting on the table like a piece of evidence no one wanted to look at again. The contract language is quite explicit, he said. Silence followed. In boardrooms, silence could be louder than arguments. Across the table, someone tapped a pen slowly against a legal document. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound seemed to measure the shrinking confidence in the room. Where is Isabella now? One investor asked. The CEO didn't answer immediately, because until this morning, he had never needed to know. She left the building, Daniel said calmly. She's nearby. The investors exchanged another quick look, the kind professionals use when they silently agree on the same conclusion. Find her, and find her fast. The CEO finally turned from the window. We'll resolve it, he said. Offer her a new contract, higher compensation, whatever it takes. One investor leaned back slowly in his chair. You fired the person who built your company's most valuable asset, he said. Before checking the ownership clause. The sentence didn't sound angry. It sounded expensive. Meanwhile, 2 blocks away, Isabella was finishing her coffee. The cafe had grown busier now. Morning light spilled across wooden tables, catching dust in golden threads that floated lazily in the air. She opened the notebook from her box. Its pages were filled with tight handwriting, diagrams, arrows connecting ideas that had taken years to refine. Most people saw the patent. Investors loved patents. Clean, official, valuable. But the real engine of the system lived here in messy sketches, careful notes, questions scribbled in margins during long nights when the algorithm refused to behave, architecture, logic, hidden shortcuts only she understood. Her phone vibrated again. Another call, different number. She answered. Isabella Marine. A new voice spoke, older, confident, controlled. Ms. Marin, this is Richard Harlow from the board. Isabella leaned back in her chair. Of course it was. I assumed someone senior would call eventually. Richard chuckled lightly. You seem very calm for someone who just changed the structure of a company. I didn't change it, Isabella said. I just read the contract. The man appreciated that answer. She could hear it in the brief pause that followed. Fair enough. Outside the cafe window, a group of suited investors exited the glass tower across the street. They paused on the sidewalk, speaking quickly with assistance. The ripple was spreading. Ms. Marin, Richard continued, we'd like to meet with you and discuss a resolution that benefits everyone. Everyone. A convenient word. Isabella closed the notebook gently. And what would that resolution look like? Well, Richard said carefully, restoring your position would be a good start. She smiled slightly. That would be awkward. Why? Because I've already been replaced. Across the street, a junior engineer was now sitting at Isabella's former desk, staring at a screen full of code he barely understood. The company had moved fast. Too fast. Richard's voice grew more cautious. We're open to alternative arrangements. Such as? A licensing agreement. Isabella tapped her finger lightly against the notebook cover. Inside the building, executives were probably scrambling through legal documents, trying to reconstruct the last 8 years like detectives arriving late to a crime scene. But contracts didn't panic. They simply waited. You've been using the algorithm for years, she said. Yes. You built your entire valuation around it. Yes. And you fired the person who owns it. A longer pause now. Richard sighed quietly. When you put it that way, it sounds unfortunate. Isabella looked again at the glass tower. The building hadn't changed, but the balance inside it had. Let me ask you something, she said. I'm listening. When the CEO said I was replaceable, did anyone in that room question it? Richard didn't answer immediately, because the truth was simple. No one had. The board trusted leadership, investors trusted numbers, and no one had looked closely enough at the quiet engineer who made the numbers possible. I see, Isabella said softly. Her tone carried no anger, just clarity. Ms. Marin, Richard said carefully, we would like to correct that mistake. Across the street, several executives had now gathered near the entrance of the building, speaking urgently into their phones. The urgency had finally arrived, but Isabella had spent 8 years learning patience. Send me your proposal, she said. And you'll consider it? She glanced at the notebook again, at the architecture that lived nowhere else. Yes, Isabella said calmly. Isabella, but you should know something. What's that? She closed the notebook and placed it gently back into the cardboard box. The patent is only the visible part. Richard went quiet. Meaning? Isabella looked through the cafe window one last time. Meaning the company across the street had just discovered something far more unsettling than a contract clause. They had discovered that the one person they called replaceable had quietly become the only person who could keep their future working. By noon, the glass tower across the street no longer looked confident. From the outside, it still stood tall, steel, glass, perfect symmetry. But inside, the rhythm had changed. Meetings had multiplied. Doors stayed closed longer. People spoke with the careful tone reserved for situations no one wanted to explain twice. The rumor had finally reached every floor. The patent belonged to Isabella. At first, it traveled as disbelief, then as confusion, and finally as a very quiet form of panic. Inside the executive boardroom, the CEO sat at the end of the long table while legal documents covered the surface like fallen leaves. Advisors spoke in measured tones, consultants ran numbers, and investors checked their phones more often than usual. Confidence was leaking from the room in small, steady drops. Have we confirmed the license termination? One investor asked. Daniel Mercer adjusted his glasses. The employment-linked license is no longer active. So we cannot legally deploy the algorithm? Daniel's answer remained calm. Not without Ms. Marin's authorization. The CEO rubbed his temples slowly. For years, the algorithm had been presented as the company's crown jewel, its competitive advantage, its unstoppable engine. Now it felt less like a crown and more like a borrowed key that had just been returned. Meanwhile, 2 blocks away, Isabella had moved to a quieter table near the window. The cafe had thinned out. Morning meetings were over, laptops were closing, and sunlight now stretched across the wooden floor in long golden lines. She opened her notebook again. Pages filled with diagrams, lines of logic, elegant structures hidden behind messy sketches. The architecture. It had taken years to make something complex look simple. Her phone buzzed. A message this time. From Richard Harlow. We've sent a proposal to your email. Isabella opened the document. The offer was generous, very generous. Restored position, equity, control over the research division, public acknowledgement of her role in the technology. The language was polite, professional, carefully worded, but beneath it ran a quiet urgency. She leaned back and read it again. Across the street, a car pulled up in front of the tower, and several investors stepped inside quickly. They walked with the focused stride of people who had decided something important. Inside the building, the CEO was now speaking faster than before. We can fix this, he said. Offer her anything she wants. One investor raised an eyebrow. Anything? The CEO hesitated, because suddenly the balance of the conversation had shifted in a way he had never experienced before. For years, he had negotiated from strength. Now he was negotiating from necessity. Meanwhile, Isabella closed the email. Her coffee had gone cold. She didn't notice. Instead, she watched the reflection of the tower in the cafe window. For 8 years, she had worked inside that building. Late nights, quiet breakthroughs, moments when the algorithm finally behaved the way it should. She remembered the first time it worked perfectly. A line of code, a simulation, a result that made her lean back and whisper to the empty office. There you are. The company had celebrated the result, but they had never asked where it truly began. Her phone rang again. Richard. She answered. Good afternoon, Ms. Marin. I read the proposal. And? It's generous. Richard sounded relieved. I'm glad you think so. She paused. But I'm not interested in returning. Silence filled the line. Across the street, sunlight flashed across the glass tower again. Richard cleared his throat. May I ask why? Isabella looked down at the notebook, at years of careful thought captured between 2 covers. Because the work was never about the office, she said. It was about the idea. And the idea still needs a home, Richard replied. Yes. Another pause. What kind of agreement would you consider? Isabella closed the notebook gently. The cardboard box sat beside her chair, simple and unremarkable. Inside it rested the quiet center of a technology the market now depended on. I'm willing to license the patent, she said. Relief entered Richard's voice immediately. That's excellent news. But the architecture stays with me. The relief faded slightly. What would that mean operationally? It means the company can use the engine, Isabella said calmly. But I control how it evolves. Richard was quiet for several seconds. He understood. The company could keep moving forward, but the direction would no longer belong solely to them. Finally, he said, I believe the board will accept those terms. Across the street, executives were still gathering in urgent circles, unaware that the outcome of their crisis was being decided beside a half-finished cup of coffee. Isabella slipped the notebook back into the box. For the first time that day, the morning felt complete. Send the revised agreement, she said. We will. Richard hesitated. Ms. Marin. One more thing. Yes? I imagine the CEO would like to apologize. Isabella stood and lifted the cardboard box. The cafe bell rang softly as she stepped toward the door. That won't be necessary, she said. Outside, the city moved forward with its usual calm rhythm. Cars passed. People hurried to meetings. The glass tower reflected the sky like a mirror that had finally learned something about humility. 8 years earlier, Isabella had entered that building as an employee. Today, she walked past it as something else entirely. Not louder, not angry, just quietly impossible to replace.